Hello, wonderful viewers. This is Jacob here with another intriguing story about love, life, and unforgettable moments with your mother-in-law. If you like stories that delve deep into family dynamics and romance, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to give it a like and leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. At age 58, Grace felt her life had come to a peaceful conclusion. Since retiring as a nurse, her days had been filled with the tranquility of country life, gardening, reading old novels, and taking walks in the quiet woods behind the house. Her husband, Jack, had passed away 3 years ago, and although the grief had not subsided, she had grown accustomed to the quiet. A phone call from Connor came out of the blue. It was Jack's son from a previous marriage, a young man to whom Grace had always been kind, but they had never been particularly close. Connor, now 25, had just graduated from law school and was struggling to find a stable job. He was losing his apartment and had no one else to turn to. "Grace, I'm in a quandary." His voice sounded hesitant over the phone. "Do you think I could stay with you for a while?" Until I get back on my feet, she hadn't seen Connor in over a year, but she remembered him as a quiet and slightly awkward teenager. "Of course," she said after a short pause, "you can stay here as long as you need to." When Connor arrived, Grace was surprised at how much he had changed. The boy she remembered was now a confident young man with broad shoulders, a sculpted jawline and stubble that made him look older than his years. He got out of the car wearing jeans and a tight t-shirt that clung tightly to his figure. Grace felt a strange stirring in her chest that she quickly pushed aside, telling herself it was just surprise at how much he had grown. "Thanks for letting me stay," Connor said, giving her a quick hug. His touch was warm and his voice deeper than she remembered. Grace led him inside, feeling a little out of place. "The guest room is ready." "I hope you'll be comfortable," she said, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The first week passed without much incident. Connor spent most of his time looking for work or going for long runs, and Grace went about her usual business. She tried to keep her distance, giving him the freedom she felt he so desperately needed. However, she couldn't ignore the small but disturbing realization of his presence. He was everywhere in the kitchen, on the couch in the evening, or walking past her room with a towel around his waist after a shower. His casual, youthful energy was in stark contrast to the quiet, structured life she had built for herself. One evening, Grace was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Connor entered the room, having just showered. His damp hair was curling slightly at the ends and his t-shirt was tight around his chest, exposing all the curves of his muscles. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she chopped vegetables. "Can I help you?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice soft but confident. Grace quickly shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "No, I have everything under control," but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped closer and reached for the water glass, lightly touching her hand. The warmth of his skin sent a small jolt through her that she hadn't experienced in years. She froze for a moment, her breath catching, but she forced herself to continue slicing as if nothing had happened. Connor lingered in the kitchen, watching her with a quiet tension that made Grace suddenly feel insecure. It had been a long time since she'd felt this awkward, but it was impossible to deny the tension that seemed to have settled between them. Later that night, lying in bed, Grace replayed the moment in her head. Had she really only imagined it? She was widowed, lonely, and hadn't been close to anyone in years. It was only natural that she might have felt out of place. But why Connor? Why now? She dismissed the thought as irrational, but deep down she knew there was something more behind it. The way he was looking at her evoked emotions in her that she hadn't felt in a very long time, emotions that she thought were long buried. It was 2 weeks after Connor had moved in when their relationship began to change noticeably. Grace went to bed early that night, and a peaceful silence enveloped the house. Around midnight, she awoke to the quiet creak of the bedroom door opening. Her heart beat faster as she rolled over onto her back and saw Connor standing in the doorway. His silhouette was illuminated by the light from the hallway, and his tall figure cast a shadow across the room. For a moment she wondered if it was a dream. "Connor," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. "Is something wrong?" He stepped into the room, his face hard to make out in the darkness. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted quietly, slowly approaching her bed. His voice was different, quieter and more vulnerable than the confident tone he usually used. Grace sat up, pulling the covers over herself. "What are you thinking about?" Connor hesitated for a moment before sitting on the edge of the bed and sinking down onto the mattress beside her. "I don't know," he sighed, rubbing the back of his head. "It's just all kind of unsettled." Without thinking, Grace reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. It was a small gesture she'd done countless times in her nursing career, but this time was different. The warmth of his skin beneath her fingers caused an unfamiliar arousal in her that she couldn't ignore. "It's going to be okay," she said quietly, holding his hand longer than necessary. "It's just a nuisance." Connor turned and looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. There was so much power in his gaze that Grace's heart raced. For a while neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. And then Connor slowly, almost hesitantly, reached out and placed his hand on hers. The touch was gentle but firm, his fingers encircling her hand in a way that made it clear this wasn't just a moment of comfort. "Connor," she whispered, her voice shaking, but she didn't pull away. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to pull back and set boundaries, but her body betrayed her by nestling lightly against him. Connor moved closer, his hand sliding slowly and purposefully down her arm, sending shivers down her spine. He nestled against her, his breath warming her cheek, and he whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you, Grace." Those words were like a spark, igniting something deep inside her that she'd buried long ago. Her heart pounded in her chest as he shortened the distance between them, and his lips touched her cheek softly. The kiss was tentative at first, but when Grace didn't pull away, it deepened and became more insistent. Grace responded to the kiss, her hands moved to his shoulders, and her body filled with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. His hands slid around her waist and pulled her closer until there was no space between them. When they finally pulled away from each other, they were both breathing heavily with their foreheads pressed against each other. Grace's thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was wrong, so wrong, and yet in that moment everything seemed incredibly right. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't need to say anything," Connor replied, his voice soft but firm. I need you to know how I feel." The air between them was thick, filled with an intensity that Grace hadn't felt in years. After the kiss, they stood still for a moment, their breathing heavy, their bodies close, but the silence was filled with unspoken thoughts. Grace could feel Connor's pulse beating as fast as her own. Her mind told her it was wrong, but her body refused to listen. Connor searched her with his eyes and without a word moved closer again, this time more purposefully. His hands slid down her neck, his fingers gently tangled in her hair, and he pulled her to him. Grace felt herself sinking into him, pulled by something she couldn't control. When their lips met again, the kiss was no longer as tentative as before. This time the kiss was filled with an urgent need, a hunger they'd both held back for far too long. Grace's hands moved to Connor's chest, feeling the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. His body was firm and hard under her touch, and she could feel the strength in him, the raw physicality of a much younger man. As her fingers traced the lines of his muscles, Connor deepened the kiss, his tongue gently parting her lips. She responded without hesitation, allowing herself to sink into the moment. Connor's hands moved from her neck down her sides, his touches soft but purposeful, as if he was thoroughly exploring every inch of her body. He ran his fingers down her back, tracing the curve of her spine, and then pulled her closer, eliminating what little distance remained between them. Grace breathed quietly into his mouth as the heat between them intensified. She could feel the hard lines of his body pressed against hers, and the tension between them was almost unbearable. "Connor," she whispered breathlessly, breaking the kiss for a moment, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she ran her palms over his hands, feeling their strength and the warmth of his skin. She could feel him restraining himself, afraid to go too far and too fast. But Grace didn't want him to stop. She didn't want to think anymore. Connor's eyes met hers again, eyes full of desire but also uncertainty. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice husky, "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to do anything you don't want to do.